Hello, everyone. Welcome to this AbleNet's webinar today. Executive Function, Building Memory and Focus for Students with Autism and Intellectual Disabilities. And let me say, this webinar should help with all students, not only students with developmental disabilities. And I, again, am thrilled that so many of you have joined this webinar or registered for this webinar. And again, I want to begin with thanking AbleNet for making this possible. What is executive functioning? It's a cognitive process, and generally, even though they are very much interrelated, there are three different functions that are associated with executive functioning, and we will go over each one of them. And each of these three webinars that I'm doing on this EF topic, that is executive functioning, I will address one of those major components. And executive functioning is critical for school success and life success itself. And what do we mean by executive functioning? It is remembering information, storing information, moving it into storage, active storage, and then being able to recall that information when we need it to apply it to a new situation to complete a task. That's one aspect. Another aspect is filtering out distractions and focusing attention, self-monitoring, self-regulation, impulse control, cognitive flexibility, which is being able to shift gears. These are all you can think in terms of EF, executive functioning. Today's focus is going to be on one of those cognitive processes called working memory. Even though, as I said, there are three different functions associated with EF, they are very much interrelated, and they work together in order for a student to be successful and in order for a person to be successful in life. And we will focus much more on the practical aspects of working memory as it relates to attention, memory, concentration, and getting the task completed. I am Padmaja Sarathy, and I have presented several webinars for AbleNet, and you may be already familiar with many of my books on autism and significant disabilities. As a matter of fact, a book called For Students with Significant Disabilities at the Crossroads of IDEA and ESSA just was released this month, and you can find the link to that at lrp.com. And I'm also working currently on a book on executive function. And so, as a matter of fact, I feel very passionate about this area, and I'm also feeling that I'm learning so much. So this is truly a learning journey for me to be sharing this information with you all. Again, these are some of the books and products that I have. Moving on to the next slide. As I said, executive function, they are critical and crucial building blocks. In other words, they provide the foundation for all later learning and school success, academic success. These are not skills that children are born with. These are skills that are developed over a period of time, and they are shaped by growth-promoting experiences, both in the classroom setting and also at home. So all these experiences, especially experiences that have a positive memory, experiences that kind of remove the stress level, experiences that they can recall back and say, positive and joyful experiences. These experiences provide the building blocks. They are the foundation for academic and learning success. And they also are critical for both cognitive and social capacities of the child. The Harvard's Center for Developing Child has a lot of information. I'm going to be sharing a video from that site, and they compare it to, imagine an air traffic control system. That's kind of what it is. It is associated in the brain with the prefrontal cortex. So this is like the air traffic control system at a very busy airport that is kind of controlling the movements of the different activities, the cognitive processes. And why do we need these executive function? As I said at the introduction, in order to be able to focus attention, hold that piece of information, and move it from short-term memory, where it stays maybe for about 18 seconds or so, into long-term memory, and to be able to recall that information later on when we need to apply it for a task, to be able to filter out any distraction that's happening around them, and control impulsive behaviors, in other words, not to be reactive, but to be very responsible in how we respond, and to be able to switch gears. That is flexibility in your thinking. There are three core functions that are associated, as I said right at the beginning. They are very much correlated, they are coordinated, but we are going to, in order for better understanding and to address some of the issues associated with each of these core functions, we are going to look at it as three different functions, and that is traditionally how they are separated. One that we are going to be looking at, which is working memory, focus, memory, attention, concentration. It is also very much linked to the self-control and impulse control. And often the second one, which is self-control, is referred to as the inhibitory control. And the third one is the cognitive or the mental flexibility. And each type of this EF skill, cognitive process, draws on the elements of the other. As I said, the EF sets the stage for all future learning and for successful adult outcomes. And particularly one of the things, which is the impulse control and self-control, combined with working memory, is what shapes even adult outcomes. And one of the researchers who has done, a team of researchers, who did a lot of work, and they found that EF is not only critical for success in school, but it is critical for success with friendships, in the job place, and for mental and physical health, and for the quality of life. It's a very interesting research produced by Moffitt et al. And so when we think about executive function, we need to think in terms of this is the process, the how of learning, focusing, remembering, planning, and problem solving. Problem solving, of course, comes a little bit later when you have these basics of remembering and focusing attention, and then comes the planning and the problem solving. But this basic processes, it enables children to effectively and efficiently master the content of learning, reading, mathematics, science, computation. All of that is the content of learning is, that's what we see in schools, but it is the EFs that kind of drive that, the process, the how of learning. And The other interesting things, why we may ask, why do we need to intervene? What can we do? Is there something we can? So that's kind of the focus of today's webinar. And what the researchers have found, you might have heard of the names Diamond and Duckworth. They have done a lot of work, and so have many other researchers. As a matter of fact, EF has become quite a hot topic these days. What they have found, especially children with poorer EFs, benefit the most from intervention. And the sooner, the earlier the intervention begins, it's much, much better for the child. So even as early as preschool, the intervention can begin, and many of the deficits in the area of EF can be addressed. And if it is not addressed in the earlier years, one of the things that happens, especially for children with developmental disabilities or autism and intellectual disabilities, their deficit areas combined with their disability aggravates the situation, and it kind of impedes their progress in schools and with academic success, and also very much the cognitive and the social success. So let's look at a video. This is from the Harvard's Developing Child Project. Let's see. I always have a little bit of trouble. Okay, it is a little slow, but it is coming along.
Science tells us that brains, minds, are built, not born. And at the center of this dynamic architecture are a set of skills called executive function and self-regulation.
Children's self-regulation and executive function are key ingredients in their lifetime performance. It's not just about learning language or learning numbers or learning colors.
We have to be able to work effectively with others, with distractions, with multiple demands. These actually are skills that contribute to the productivity of the American workforce.
Look at your shapes. What should you have done next?
Educators, I think, are looking for just this sort of thing. And when we describe what we mean by executive function, they say, yes, that's it. That's exactly, the problem. These kids, they can tell me these rules, but they can't actually use them.
What's this? A toolbox. A toolbox.
What is executive function?
Safety goggles.
Probably the best way to think about it is sort of like an air traffic control system in the brain. Just like an air traffic control system has to manage lots of airplanes going on lots of runways and really exquisite timing and so on. A child has to manage a lot of information and avoid distractions. We really think of it as involving working memory and inhibitory control and mental flexibility. Take a situation where a child is having to take turns. So first of all, the child has to have inhibitory control. The child has to be able to stop whatever he or she is doing and let the other child take a turn. But when it's your turn again, you also have to remember what it is you're supposed to be doing. So that pulls on working memory. If the children who are taking the turns after you do something unpredictable, you have to be able to adjust what you're going to do next. And that requires mental flexibility. Children who are struggling with these capacities often look like children who just aren't paying attention, or children who are deliberately not controlling themselves.
If you don't have self-regulation, you act out and the teacher puts you in timeout and so then you miss part of the learning that's going on, and then you are more upset because you're behind, and so you act out, and so you get this downward spiral.
How does executive function develop?
7, and +4.
In little children, and even in the infant and toddler years, you begin to see the roots of executive functioning skills. What's going on in our brains is unbelievably intricate and complicated.
The prefrontal cortex, or the front third of the brain, is important for executive function. But it's more than just prefrontal cortex. This region doesn't act alone. It's involved in controlling your behavior through its interactions with all other parts of the brain. The brain goes from a situation where you've got nearest neurons communicating very strongly with each other and ignoring the rest of the brain, to these widespread networks that are connecting these different areas. Executive function changes over the life course. It improves radically over the first few years.
I got a Max Prime.
It continues to improve throughout adolescence. It's not until early adulthood that you have the adult-type networks that are very strongly activated that connect different brain regions together.
Let's take notes.
Also, we believe that executive functions can be trained.
It's just like going to the gym. So the more you practice in these areas, the stronger the capacity is likely to become, because you're hoping to strengthen those neural connections.
Aha! You're at 24.
Slowly but surely, you're going to be able to step back, and that child's going to go into the world with these skills where they can get along with other people, change rules, and they can be flexible, and they can accomplish new things, and they're unafraid.
I got bit by my dog in my arm. Oh dear.
If we don't learn these skills during the childhood and adolescent years when they're coming online, we are really ill-equipped as an adult to hold a job, to maintain a marriage, to raise children, to get along with each other, to basically be part of a civil society.
You're okay.
Hello, I hope you were able to hear that video. One of the interesting things about EF is what researchers found that at 5 years of age, if they could evaluate, that functioning could very well predict what would happen later on. 6 years later, their literacy and numeracy skills could be predicted by the executive functioning at 5 years of age. So it has a very unique kind of link to the academic achievement. And you would have heard that they said if they did not have these foundational building blocks in the early years, it impacted how they behaved during their adolescence and their ability to cope with those significant changes that happen during adolescence. Now, coming back to today's focus of the webinar, which is working memory, it is the capacity to hold information, manipulate that information in our heads, and to be able to use that information to apply to performing a task. And holding multiple pieces of information and working with it could be challenging for some children, because what they have to do is to connect these pieces of information, and they have to arrive at a general principle from that information. They have to be able to understand cause and effect. And this is also necessary for children to make that social connections and social interactions. They have to make sense of when the teacher is presenting information either in a story form or a nonfiction text, any kind of linguistic information, when they are performing math operations, and when they are stopping an activity and they are restarting an activity. They have to kind of remember that information that's in active storage and pull that information to apply to a new situation. So what are some challenges that occur in EF challenges, especially with children with special needs? Children with intellectual disabilities, they may experience difficulty recalling information. When you are presenting multiple directions, all of those multiple directions that you provide, it may kind of go into one, and they may not be able to separate these directions and follow that directions in order to be able to. So when you are presenting a lesson and it has kind of interlinked concepts, they may not be able to understand that concept and to apply that concept. Students with autism spectrum disorders, they also have executive function differences, particularly, for example, in the area of cognitive flexibility, which is shifting gears. And they also have difficulties in self-regulation. What is cognitive flexibility? That is shifting gears, being able to apply one rule in a classroom, maybe another room in outside, and being able to transition from one setting to another setting, transition from one activity to another, stopping an activity and starting a new activity. Those are all challenges, in addition to some working memory challenges. And there is also, which I have not included, it is children with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. There is some debate regarding their working memory issues, but several researchers say they also experience some working memory difficulties, but definitely much more of the self-regulation, inhibitory control. And so it is important that we address some of these difficulties right at the early stages, understand what those difficulties are, and apply intervention procedures, because intervention, especially as I said right at the beginning, when it begins in the early years, and also those children who have the most difficulty with executive function benefit the most from intervention. So let's look at some of the challenges that some of our children, especially children with intellectual disabilities and autism spectrum disorders, experience. Memory and forgetfulness, that's storage and retrieval. We give instruction, and we end up having to repeat that instruction, and sometimes we have to repeat it individually to the student when the instruction was given as a group. And one of the things that happens frequently, one of the problems associated with this, we end up prompting far too many times, and we are not even providing the students sometimes the chance to comprehend that information and to apply that information. Then they also experience poor recall of information. And I'm going to suggest some strategies during this webinar as to how do we address some of this recall challenges. How can we tailor our instruction, make instructional adaptations and adjustments, and make that learning in such a way that information moves from short-term into active storage. How do we connect that information, new information, with something that they have already learned? And one of the other challenges that they have, many children with EF challenges and with special needs, is they may not be always organized, and they may not bring all of the materials. For example, they may forget to hand in the homework. So some of the associated issues with working memory is planning and prioritizing and following through with all of the steps required. So, and it could be because they are experiencing a cognitive overload because of the processing speed issues. Too many ideas and too many concepts are jamming at the same time, and they are not able to handle that kind of an overload. For those of you who, if you're a diagnostician or a psychologist joining this webinar, there is a resource how do we assess working memory that you may find helpful. And I've also listed it under resources at the end of this webinar among the last slides in this webinar. You will find this a helpful resource in assessing working memory challenges and difficulties. So continuing with some of the other challenges, what are some academic skill difficulties? If it is a skill difficulty, can we address that so that some of the executive functioning challenges could be reduced? Because if it is an academic skill difficulty, how can we address that? Is it a reading comprehension issue? Is it abstract math concepts that need to be combined with something hands-on and multisensory to address some of the mental math challenges? Is it processing and learning new vocabulary that is an issue? Or is it organizing the thoughts into a kind of a pattern so that when they are comparing and contrasting information, they can draw the general principle? How do we organize the thoughts for a writing activity? So these are all some of the issues that are kind of related to EF, but also it could be an academic skill difficulty. So it is important for us to address both. So what kind of working memory challenges have you observed in your students? Does the student experience difficulty completing? Is it a long-term project? If it is a quick, short-term that's done at the end of that lesson, it's easier, but when it comes to they have difficulty following through, planning, prioritizing, and completing the project. Is that the issue? Or are they experiencing challenges organizing themselves, their work, and to get started and initiating the activity? Are they failing to turn in homework? Or are they resisting in seeking help when they need help? So these are all things that you need to look at and try to address those issues so that it doesn't become a major academic issue, and these are all planning and prioritizing issues that is very much related to EF and working memory that you can address so that on an ongoing basis, so that the students can be much more successful in the academic environment and academic learning outcomes, in advancing learning outcomes. So identify a working memory difficulty that you have experienced. I'm going back to the previous slide so that you can, this is a survey that will come, and you can identify what is the EF challenge that you experience with your students in your classroom. So go ahead and complete the survey, and so one of the major problem seems to be following multi-step direction. As a matter of fact, this is in a way somewhat easier to address, because what we need to do when we are giving multiple directions, which may involve academic direction, it may be just following the rules, it could be, I am assuming everybody has completed, and we are looking at the survey results, and the survey indicated, we looked at survey results. Let me go back to the previous slide, and it said following multiple step direction was the biggest challenge. As a matter of fact, I personally think while this may be the most frequently occurring, it is also maybe somewhat easier to address when we find that if we increase strength, if we build EF strength, it may itself help to address the multi-step direction. So one of the things we can do is build on that working memory. How do we strengthen? the working memory, so that not only we address the multiple step direction, but also the concept understanding, also moving information from current memory into active storage. What are some working memory builders that we can use? One of the things that research is showing is when students are learning, it has to be a kind of joyful environment that reduces stress. So one of the things that we need to use a lot of is kind of novelty. In other words, at the beginning of the lesson, you are increasing their attention and focus and concentration so that the memory becomes strong, is use of novelty. You increase their fun level. In other words, you increase their dopamine level, the pleasure hormone, so that they are in a very receptive mode to learn. And maybe that's something you can use with your multiple step instruction and direction. And one of the other things that you can use is a kind of during your lessons is use role play. Very seldom I see a lot of drama and role play being used. Let's say they are practicing vocabulary. It would be a good idea, for example, when you're practicing new vocabulary, to use the game of charades and have students kind of demonstrate an action that's related to that. And another thing, one of the most important things when you are teaching a new lesson or bringing in a new concept is tap into the prior knowledge. What do they know already about that topic? What kind of positive memories do they have? Can you present a story and connect it with individual students so that their experience and what have they experienced on that? And when you connect it with individual students, it makes it personal for them and they are much more motivated to learn. And the other thing that is extremely critical for building and practicing and strengthening working memory and to be able to recall, to apply it to a task, is lots and lots and lots of practice. Repetition is key. And then the other important thing is for the instructor to model it as much as possible. I think I shared most of these things on this slide through the graphic organizer that I had. And by the way, that is one of the very important tools to use with your students, a concept map, a graphic organizer, a brainstorming tool. And the other important thing is connect, as I said, activate the prior knowledge and connect it with the old information that they already know. That's very, very important for the brain connections to happen. Then, as much as possible, verbal presentation paired with visual. And maybe that is something you can do when you are presenting multiple steps to a task. Combine it with visual. That will help with later recall. And as I said, personalized real-life examples, engaging students immediately after a presentation, an auditory presentation, immediately follow it up with a hands-on activity for about 10 minutes. And then provide a variety of visual tools that they can use either individually or with another student. Graphic organizers, concept maps, Venn diagrams when they are making comparisons, T-charts or choice boards, where they are making selections from 3 or 4 choices. These are all important memory hooks, memory tools that will strengthen their long-term memory and the working memory. And how do we sustain attention and focus during instruction? How do we make sure that the students are not moving away, they are not going into another kind of thinking and focusing attention on the lesson. Use, as I said, novelty and motivating materials to grab the student attention. One of the things that I would like to mention, I will be focusing on it much more in my third webinar when I talk about impulse control, inhibitory control. If you could have like a 5 minutes, 3 minutes of a mindfulness session, in meditation session, where they are bringing all their focus on a single object, single visual image, and they are calm and they are quiet and kind of prime the brain for learning. That will also help bring focus and attention. And many school districts and individual schools are experimenting with this kind of approach, and they are finding the students are much calmer. That's why I will address it during my third webinar in greater detail, but that's something that will help sustain student attention. Incorporating a lot of multi-sensory materials, and then using a lot of storytelling, because stories have kind of a episodic memory, and that they can connect much more quickly. And role play, if you can act words like volcano, an earthquake, a thunderstorm, and make it like a charades game, or make it like a little bit of a drama and role play. And not only will it increase their fun level, but it also, because the whole movement, physical movement is involved, it will increase their memory. And it will also engage the learner quickly. And it will increase their motivation and, as I said, the joyfulness of the lesson. And the other important thing is those students who get easily distracted, instead of putting them away at the end of the classroom, can they be right in the middle? And can they be sitting next to a student who usually models good attention and focus levels, so that a peer who can model good attention and also away from the door and away from distraction. And some of the other tools that you can use, teaching and using mnemonics, providing kind of memory anchors and tools and charts and posters with a lot of visuals. For example, sticky notes. Sticky notes, very easy to use. What are things that I need to do? If they can kind of jot down what are the things they have to do. Number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4. And let's say 4 different colored sticky notes they need to do. And maybe they can use them on a repeated basis, and you can make it once and for repeated directions that are given on a regular basis. Or for completing a task or a long-term project, if they can have daily sticky note reminders. Reminders about handing in homework. If there is something, that's kind of a daily thing that they have to hand in homework, maybe something on their desk. And keeping thoughts in a thought bubble. I see some of these letters have moved away from the way I designed it. Anyway, thought bubbles, that's kind of a fun thing, and they can maybe draw a little thought bubble and put there, remember to do this, kind of a thing. Reminder cards. Those are all things that you can use to strengthen both working memory and also with their organization skills, and also to complete their task and not to have to be reminded of what they have to do. And they will also act as the memory anchors, and it will strengthen their working memory. And one of the other important things is playing games to strengthen executive function, and especially working memory. It increases the motivation. Playing any kind of game increases their motivation and their attention. They're mental math games, you kind of quickly giving out the answers. Recalling and repeating a number pattern, and giving out the mental math answers, recalling a sequence in order, vocabulary games, lots and lots of, there is a wonderful game, I like pizza, and on that pizza I can have tomatoes, and then somebody repeats the whole sentence and then add another ingredient, and it goes on like that. That strengthens, and you can use it for science words, math words, and new vocabulary words that you're using, and connect it to a theme. Card games and board games, games that require self-monitoring so that they take turns and they have to remember what the previous person did and what their moves are. And strategy games like chess, because it involves a lot of planning, a lot of strategizing. They have to think of all the moves that they used. Those are all things, and that will also help. And so ask yourself, is your environment, evaluate yourself, is your environment, is your instruction providing the necessary scaffolding to assist with working memory? Are you tapping into prior knowledge? Are you using novelty kind of at the beginning of the lesson, or when you see that the attention is kind of waning? Are you using quickly some novelty to bring their attention back? Are you using peer supports? Are you using hands-on activities? And multisensory, we don't use enough concrete objects, especially for our students with intellectual disabilities and autism spectrum disorders. And that concrete materials goes immediately, when they touch it, it immediately goes into their brain. Brainstorming helpers. These are the true brainstorming helpers. Are you using problem solving? Are you using project-based activity? These are all questions you can ask and see if you are providing the necessary scaffolding for your students. And looks like I'm going to run a little bit more time, take a little bit more time. Let's say John, for example, has difficulty paying and sustaining attention. What can you do? Certainly preferential seating. That would help, close to the teacher, close to the area of instruction. And also another important academic task adjustment, academic seating adjustment we can do is, if the lesson is going to be 35 minutes or 40 minutes, maybe he can take a break and come back and rejoin the activity, rejoin the instruction instead of completely losing out during the last 20 minutes. So have a built-in break. And as I said before, storytelling, role play to increase his motivation, multimedia presentation, and visual cue and support. I do want to mention this, a kind of a sign, a card, a visual card that shows eyes on the teacher, ears are listening. Just those symbols that's kind of shown to the student or placed on the desk very quickly without drawing too much attention to the student instead of an auditory instruction. You need to pay attention. We just use a quick visual cue. And lots of motivation and engagement type of strategy. Now, Anna's problem is different. She has difficulty recalling information. So she may need a kind of a brainstorming tool, that a concept map that kind of draws her previous knowledge about the topic so that she can make some connections. So let her use a graphic organizer tool. Another thing is she can sit with a peer support person, peer who is able to remember information, and they work on a pair and share. Have the student reflect and share with a peer when she has learned at the end of the lesson so that she can practice what she knows, and this practice when sharing will help remember that information. In other words, let's say she is learning addition, she uses a kind of a equation too, and she demonstrated demonstrates it to her peer, and similarly, if she is learning about why we have rain and what is caused by what causes rain, and let's say she is learning a science lesson, or she is learning about the characters in a story and details, she can explain it as a pair-share activity at the end of the lesson using many of the tools that I mentioned earlier on. And of course, role play would help also. Jose, he struggles with holding the information in his mind while solving math problem. In his particular case, it's more of an academic skill difficulty, so that needs to be addressed. And for him, he would need a lot of one-on-one instruction, a systematic instruction with a step-by-step approach to overcome some of the skill deficits. And we can certainly use also the pair-share technique that I mentioned before, so that he demonstrates it both to an adult and later on to a peer, and the peer has to already know that concept. So, and then of course, lots and lots of repetition and practice is needed. And in his particular case, Jose will also need lots of concrete representation to strengthen his skill knowledge and the concept knowledge. There are a variety of games that will strengthen working memory, puzzles, crossword puzzles, and Sudoku that can be done. Quite often I go into some classroom and they say the students are taking a mental break. And instead of just having free time during that time, it would be a good time as a game break, brain break as a game station during that time. This one lists several apps that will strengthen working memory and EFs in general. One of these, CogMed, research has found that students with EF deficit, in other words, executive function difficulties, benefit from CogMed training. And there are also many other researchers who say mindfulness techniques and yoga techniques also help with paying attention and sustaining attention. So several apps are listed, and some of them, like this CogMed and Plan and Organize apps, Idea Sketch, for example, is free app. And certainly you can share this information with families, and maybe families and parents have joined this, and they can practice it at home. And many references are listed here, and you will find many of them helpful in learning more about working memory and EFs in general. As I said, I am working on a book myself. It should come out later in this year, and during one of these webinars, maybe in the future, I'll share information about it. And these are all additional references related to this topic. And thank you very much. And the next executive webinar would be focusing on cognitive flexibility, mental flexibility, shifting gears, and that will be on March 15th. And again, I want to thank AbleNet for organizing this webinar, and I'm extremely grateful to all of you participants for joining this webinars. Let's hope we help many, many students to gain strengths in working memory and thus strengthen and build their EF skills.